Hello and welcome to Cartsburn Publishing with myself, Vincent Gillen. Today I shall be looking at some local history, looking at one particular locality in Greenock through time. This place is Belville, or Belville Street, perhaps from the French meaning beautiful village, or maybe, with a bit of poetic license, beautiful view. It has been my view for the last 30 years, and in part the inspiration for the name Cartsburn Publishing. As you can see the Cartsburn from here, and also because of the Cartsburn shipbuilding yard where my father worked in Scott's Shipbuilders. So this is the view of a summer's night from my window on Belville Street, and I think you can see why it might be seen as being Belle View, or beautiful sight or vision. This was taken on a summer night not so long ago, but just when the new container terminal liner pier or quay was being made. This was the ship that was dredging that part of the river in order to dig the pillars for the quay. So what, maybe three years ago. Anyway, that's why it's Belville. So if you look at our last view, we're looking from, on this map of 1825, we're looking from about here, where the red mark is, down to the harbour. So in 1825 you can see the setup of the town. So the harbours, so it's East India, the East and West Harbour. This is William Street here. Centre of the town, really busy as you'd expect, and then the start of the West End. But prior to the West End getting built, the place to be, or the houses that were built by the richer part of society in Greenock, would be above the town. So on Bank Street, Mearn Street, around here, and over to the East End at Belville Place and St Lawrence Street up to Hill End. So this whole area would be above and away from the smog and the smell of the centre of the town. This map of 1825 was by John Woods, and you can see it's noted that the sandbank is the property of the town of Greenock. That's actually quite an important fact, because it was this that allowed all the traffic to pass by the front of Greenock and be attracted or be taken in to the harbours. Greenock would later fight with Glasgow, who wanted to dredge this sandbank in order to create a straighter path to Glasgow. This was the one thing that Greenock held over Glasgow, the ownership of this sandbank. So we now move on to the 1841 map by McFarlane, and you can see a bit more detail on the East End of Greenock and Belville Place. We have Garville Park, home of Bailey Gamble, a West Indies merchant, and we have the details of what would be the Eastern Harbour, the East India Harbour, and the shipyards, and what would become the Victoria Harbour. Of course, if you know a bit of the history, this area is known as Cartsdyke or Crawfordsdyke. So down from the Cartsburn, east would have been known as Cartsdyke or Crawfordsdyke. This was the important Cartsdyke quay from which some ships in the Darien scheme left, and in fact this was the more important village more important than Greenock at one point. But as Shaw Stewart took over and built harbours, it became an adjunct to Greenock and taken over. But the details in this map are quite fascinating, because McFarlane put the names of the house owners. So here we have Belville Place, which should later become Belville Street, and you can see this mansion here, McLeish. This was Adam McLeish, who was a provost of Greenock and also a sugar merchant and dealer, who obviously had connections with the West Indies. If you go down to St Lawrence Street, this section here, you can see various houses running along what we would know or come to be known as Serpentine Walk, above the Bally Brae or Ballast Brae. So the Bally Brae would continue up to St Lawrence Street, but here we have Rose Hill, which belonged to Mr Allen, who was the founder of the Clyde Foundry, which was down here on East Hamilton Street, and which would later become Kincaid's. Over to the east end we had, or further east we had Rather Street, where Lear Reid and other sugar refiners lived, just in this house here. Over here we had Captain George on the Wood Cottage, it was called, and this would later be occupied by Canon Michael Condon of the Catholic congregation. And at Plantation was a Mr Gray, a grocer, who obviously made his money from selling sugar in the main, and retired at 50. Rose Hill would later become known as Spunk's Castle, which was the name given to the house where a lady who'd met a rich merchant and who sold matches. So basically the Scottish name for a match was a spunk, and this became a Spunk Castle. So a lot of these houses were still in existence right up to the 50s and 60s, until they were taken down in the renovations or in the kind of development of the East End. As I said, in the harbour, what became Victoria Harbour were wood yards, the wood yards of Mr Haddo, and of course this would all turn into shipyards as the century went on. This is our first contemporary image of the view over Belville in 1825. You hopefully recognise from the previous photos this view, so the view from Belville Street down towards the Custom House here, East India Harbour, this area which becomes the Victoria Harbour. On the right, on this building, is the sugar refinery of the Fairies or Faries. Interesting in that it was the only one directly adjacent to the river, which was, interestingly, the reason why the sugar refining industry left Greenock in the 1990s, because of the lack of direct access to a port. So we started off with the right idea of bringing sugar straight in off the boats into the refinery, and then moved up the hill to the Shaw's Water. In the foreground, I should say, you can see this idea that it's still agricultural and countryside, but looking over a scene of trade and industry, with some of the fine houses that belonged to the merchants and sea captains who lived at Cartstike. So again, busy along the front with the houses of of the rich and well-to-do sitting behind, but within walking distance of their industries or their businesses. The next image is of the Greenock Glasgow or Greenock Paisley and Glasgow Railway, which was started in 1841, which is a really crucial part in the history of the development of the town. So you can see the same view looking down towards the harbour, maybe slightly further back, but you can see the railway along the cutting. This is still the Ballybray, St Lawrence Street, but you can see as it heads into town, this is the familiar point that you'll see in the next few photographs. Warehouses, sugar refineries, chimneys, and the ships coming in from East Indies and the West Indies, but also the odd steamboat. So the advance of steam is what is being shown here in the development of a town. It was hoped by investing in the railway, which took most of the money of the rich in Greenock, that Greenock would become the centre for all imports into Scotland. So instead of going up to Glasgow, it could be dropped off in Greenock and then transported by rail up to Glasgow. That was the hope, but in fact Glasgow continued to develop the river by dredging it in order to be self-sufficient, or in order, like, Greenock wouldn't get the business. But there's always been that rivalry with Glasgow, and this was proof, according to the Greenockians, that Glasgow was not a friend. So, of course, the people who benefited initially from the coming of the railway were the landowners, who got large sums of money for giving their land to the railways, but it created issues further down the line when it came to, as I said, the business of the harbours. Again, another view of the town, this is by Thomas Carswell, and it's a very pristine view of a developing town. So you can see the railway front and centre, you can see the ordered harbours on your right on the riverside, and you can see the rows of housing with factories and warehouses. In the distance you can see church steeples and the verdant scene of the West End. So it's a vision of what Greenock could be. It's almost like a promotional shot to show what Greenock is and what it could be. Of course, the natural view would be steam, smoke, pollution, and so on. So yes, a sanitised version of what Greenock was like. So this is a view from the 1980s, just to show you that railway line is the constant theme in these images. So that bend is the same bend, obviously, that we saw in the previous photographs, but this is the 1980s. You can see the development of the town. So, you know, Arthur Street, Kincaid's, over towards the high flats at Bow Road in the town centre, up towards Westburn or Berry Yards refinery up here. So same scene, but quite a few years later on, but it shows you the constant is that railway, and how change is a permanent feature. Again, another view. This is the Scots Canteen. Scots shipyard, down to the electrician's office, and over to the container terminal, but still all this industry along the waterfront. It was often said that you could drive from Port Glasgow through to Greenock and not see the river at any point because of this industry. This, of course, would later become, was it Cigna, health insurance, and of course Scots has disappeared. So that's the initial was to show you that view northwest from Belville Street and how it's changed over the years through industrialisation, shipbuilding and engineering, and the continuous demand for harbour space. I'll now look at some aerial photographs just to show you a kind of overall picture and just some details of the East End. This was an image taken by the Luftwaffe in 1939 because obviously when they were coming to attack they wanted to pick their targets, and this shows you the Cartsburn and then the Cartsdyke in the mid-yard of Scots, absolutely stowed with building. So we've got frigates, submarines, the whole lot, all being busy here at work, with the engine works of across the road and the railway line, of course, coming in. So this is St Lawrence Street at the bottom, down under the railway. So a significant view of industrialisation and shipbuilding. Scots were unique in some respects in that it was the longest, it was the longest shipbuilding yard in terms of years continuous building, but it tended in the later days to rely on admiralty work, or as some people might call it, the admiralty work. So more profitable but dependent on political influence. As we can see how shipbuilding went to Glasgow and to Barrow in the later years. Some would say because they had more political representation, more MPs, more voters. Harsh fact of life, I guess, but I think this is one of the major influences in how the shipbuilding industry in Greenock declined and how it wasn't supported. But again, politics. So again, a view over Scotch Yard in the 1960s, looking west to Victoria Harbour, East India Harbour, the dry docks. Interesting fact that you might not know is that this is the Scots dry dock and this is Lamment's dry dock, both built in the early 1818s to 20. Not sure which was first, but it's always assumed that Scots was first, but I believe they were simultaneous and possibly Lamment's first. The Lamment's was one built by the council at the time, and the Scots one was built privately by Steeles. So again, we filled in possibly the oldest one and kept what is often mistakenly called the oldest in the world, but it certainly isn't. So we're now, this is a great photo. From a different angle you can see the Greenock and Grangemouth dockyard, or if I'm talking to children, where the drive-through McDonald's is. The Great Harbour, the West James Watt Dock, and in the foreground we have Burwhirley Road. We have the prefabs here, and this is the post-blitz, if you like. So Belville Street coming down here, along Morton Terrace, gone along Crawford Street and up Bewhirley Road. So you can see this is all gone now. This is Belville Avenue. These are the new houses, and this is Belville Place School. So this would all disappear in the 60s to be replaced by the high flats. And of course, this would all disappear in the late 80s and 90s. So if we're now looking west, you can see Ingleston Street this way with the high flats on Belville Street, and then of course Victoria Harbour, East India Harbour, over to Princess Pier, or what became Container Terminal. And the difference, you can see all this higgledy-piggledy kind of mess of growth, industrial growth, up Baker Street, which was basically the result of the Shaw's Water. So the industries were built on this line of the drop, and then we can see the planned beauty and vision of the West End. This, just out of interest, is where my dad's family came from, Ingleston Street, 19 Ingleston Street, basically 100 yards from his work here at Rankin and Blackmore's. Such is the way of the working class, you know, you lived as close to your work. My dad often talked about taking my dad's piece to work at lunchtime. So the East End was basically the home of the working classes because it was easy access to their works and the engine works and the shipyards. This is a view from Belville Street. This is Miha's images showing a very busy Greenock harbour and river scene. Plenty of boats, tugs in the river, ferries in the East India. Just an industrial view, and something quite different from what it's like now. Again, a view looking straight over Belville Street to Lawrence Street with Scott's shipyard. This is the Scott's Basin, this is the Scott's Dry Dock. So from early to mid 60s this image is from. Again, this is the start of the construction of the high flats on Belville Street. Just a view over, you know, it's that contrast, isn't it, between the industrial shipyards, warehouses, engine works, over to the Highlands, the snow-capped peaks of the Highlands. It's the contrast that Greenock presented. Again, another view down Arthur Street through Kincaid's works here, Victoria Harbour, and of course the railway cutting through. So what we've seen is, as I say, the view over from Belville Street. So the industrialisation, the progress from the 1800s, when it was the home of, or a kind of countryside walk. People talked in the 1820s and 1830s of going for a walk into the country past the Cartsburn, you know, so it was a rural idyll, you know, beautiful place to go and walk. So from 1820s onwards, you can see the development of the harbours, then the industries of the engine works and the shipyards. So this attracted people needed housing, they moved to the East End near their work, as I said, and the houses were built up. This was the workforce. But there were two important or crucial things in the 20th century that changed everything. And of course these are the wars. A traumatic time for many, and fundamentally changed how Britain saw itself. So I'll just take a look at some of the newspaper clippings for the First World War, and it just shows you, like the human side of living in the East End. The notices of bereavement of people from Belville Street. Over 2,500 people were killed in Inverclyde in the First World War, and this isn't to mention the thousands that were injured or gassed or shocked. So again, it's in just notifications. Mr. William Deacher of 80 Belville Street has been informed from the War Office of the death of his son, Sergeant James Deacher of the King's Own Scottish Borderers. Lance Corporal Robert Craig, 2nd Battalion against Second Highlanders, from using Belville Street. So all the kind of personal things, the effects of these men, often, as I say, employed by Scots or the local industries. This is really an interesting one. This is William Kerrigan of the 5th Argyles, who were the local volunteer or territorial battalion. He lived in Belville Street and was involved in the attack at Achibaba on the 12th of July 1915, for which he won a DCM. With great bravery, he advanced under heavy fire over 200 yards of open ground to get into communication with troops on the right flank, returning with information which enabled the position to be consolidated. So he worked in the shipyards, but I have letters, or I've seen letters that he wrote home, basically saying that he longed for a drink of cold water from Lochmount and Glen, and hoped that the people who were at home were looking after his allotments on Belville Street. So again, that human touch and that connection with Belville Street, the people who were born and bred and lived here, but then went to serve their country in the war. The thing about the charge at Achibaba was that it took place on the 12th of July, and more local men were killed on that one day than at any other time in Greenock's history. Unfortunately, we tend to remember the 12th of July for other reasons, so perhaps their fate and their honour isn't commemorated as much as it should be, or as much as it could be. Again, this is just part of the exhibition that was done about the First World War and William Kerrigan. He came back for a rest and was taken to Capello, as a treat. If you look closely, he doesn't look that happy, but maybe that's just watching Morton. Again, more notifications of casualties from Belville Street. So we come to the Second World War and the nights of the 6th and 7th of May 1941. I showed you earlier the image of the Luftwaffe photograph identifying targets, and of course the targets were the shipyards. Unfortunately, the collateral damage, as they would call it nowadays, was on the housing of the East End, because Greenock was actually a difficult target to hit. Long and narrow, so it depended on which way the enemy planes came over, but they had limited chance to hit their targets. As a result, Scots only had about 6 bombs hit, and the rest, as you no doubt will know, hit Greenock and the East End especially. This is the west end of Belville Street. Quite significant damage. Again, another close-up of the damage on Belville Street. high explosive bomb obviously came right down, right through the buildings and took out those that were in the cellar. The story that I heard is, of course, is that there was a young girl and her father. She wasn't well, so he stayed with her, and the blast from this bomb blew them out of the window and they survived, while the rest who had gone to the cellar or the dunny had all died. This is at the top of St Lawrence Street, and I think this is the cleared site from that damage. So again, looking down St Lawrence Street here, up Belville Street, you can see Belville Place School, the housing here, Elim Church and the red sandstone. So the effects of war. We now look at what it was like to live in Belville Street. This is a view, again, looking at Orchard Street and over towards the Scots Engine Works. The church here, and you know, it's that vision of a smoky, industrial, unpleasant view, you know, where pollution was the thing. Housing conditions wouldn't have been great. You know, this is a colour view from Miha of the Belville Place, and again 1964 a view of Belville Place School. After the war there was a need, because of the blitz damage and also the general condition of housing. It wasn't uncommon, you know, as we know, to have like set-in beds, and with large families people slept head to toe. My father told me how they used to rent out a room in their house and some of the children would be farmed off to other relatives in order that they could get the income from the lodger. So this, you know, housing, you know, shared toilet facilities on the landings, etc. We look at some of the old photographs of the Miha and they say these buildings could have been saved. Some could have, but in essence they weren't fit for purpose. But we went down another route there, and you'll see that in the future, in the slides to come, the route that the council and whole of Britain went down. So we're looking at the start of the 60s, we're looking up Belville Street, you can tell by the cars, you know, so this is East William Street up here again, and all these have been replaced, all these buildings have been replaced. And they were replaced by high flats. And this, I say, this was a vision. How do you get more people housed quickly? And the multi-storey flats were the choice. As it turns out, they only lasted about 40 years, 60 years. But again, you can see the stilts here, red sandstone flats of Belville Street, right down to Morton Terrace, then along and up Buckwhirley Road, then over towards Port Glasgow, Capello, Baxter Street area around here. This is the west end of Belville Street, and you can see, I think this house here might be the original Provost MacLeish's building. Could be wrong, but I have a view that this might be. It looks a wee bit out of place there, and it is possible, and it certainly seems to have lasted into the 50s and 60s. And this was again, this was taken over by this land. I think this is Wood Cottage. Again, this was taken over by Father Condon, and he expanded this into a Catholic school. So again, moving on to the 60s, and this need to change the housing stock because of neglect, and also because of the way they were built with it, as I said, with outside loos and things. This is the back of Belville Street. Again, some views as we go through here of Belville Street area in the 1960s. Again, this is a common feature of life in the various areas of Greenock, but in particularly in Belville Street, was that you had your own community. There was no need really to go into town unless for something special. You had your own community of shops. You had your Italian ice cream shop. You had everything that you needed in these small shops. Butchers, grocers, tobacconists, all within walk, the local shop. So again, looking up. From the hairdressers here to Gino's Italian. This is the corner of St. Lawrence Street. Again, you'd be hard pressed to recognise this view now. So we have the Elim Church on your left. This view is the same on your left basically, but this is all gone. So these are the gap sites from the Blitz, and which would make way for the high flats, and this would be Belville Place School. This is an image I found online of the congregation at Elim. And of course there was quite a few churches, again with the shops. You had your community churches, so you had the East Congregational, you had the Elim, you had St. John's Mission and the Cartsburn Augustine, so lots of churches in the area, to serve the local religious needs. And of course this is something else that has changed entirely, and I don't think there are any churches in the East End now. And this is the demolition of the Elim. So more views now of the back greens, the wash houses at the back of Belville Street. You might remember, of course, you took your turn, you had your day, you had your hours that you were given to do your washing in the outhouses. Everybody took their turn, and heaven forfend if you missed it or took someone else's turn. Again, just wonderful views of how we used to live. There's a book that we published by Tom Scott called Memory Bubbles, and it was a great title, because memories do bubble up, in your subconscious or in your conscious, and it's when you start looking at images that you start remembering things. So I would imagine that if you saw this image and you had lived there, it would bring back memories of your neighbours, childhood, playing in the back green, etc. And this is part of the community life. Everyone would know each other, or possibly related to each other, but there was that bond of being in the same area So thus, you had different areas that had their own identity. You had the Heeds of the Hill, you know, Ann Street area, town centre. Everyone who grew up would have their own identity, their own local houses, their own local churches, going to different cub groups or scout groups or boys brigade. So again, up towards the church and this back view of Belville Street. So we now head over to the west end of Belville Street. You can see gap sites over towards, back over towards East End. The Crescent Cafe. So again, it's difficult to realise that to remember this sharp turn on Belville Street. Along here, down Orchard Street, and then back along Ingleston Street. It wasn't the straight road that we've got today. St Lawrence's Church, obviously, here. Another view looking northeast at Belville Street. What I heard was that because of this, you could jump on and off buses here because they'd slowed down so much to get around this corner. Again, a view along Belville Street. And I think the house, the Adam or McLeish house that we were talking about, would be here, if my bearings are right. Serpentine Walk. So again, this is a view along, the path that's currently there is probably still essentially the Serpentine Walk. So from the Belville Gardens. So of course these are all gone. And this is the view at St Lawrence Street. Again, all gone. I think, is this the East Congregational Church, which then moved up to Whirley Road? So again, come down here, go along here, and you'll go along to the Now Road, to where the post office is, along here. And this is the railway sidings. So it's, again, seems quite a weird place to build houses because you're straight up against that hill. So there's very little room, and this would be Belville Place School above. This is the hill we're talking about, so not much in the way of back gardens here. A view straight onto the railway and onto the shipyards. Put your washing out into a rock face. So here we are at the top of St Lawrence Street, looking west. I think this might be, or someone said it was Provost Simpson Stevenson's cobbler shop. Could be wrong, but it was around this area. And again, if you look at that view today, it's substantially different. A view down over the church onto the railway line. And the view along the main street up to the red sandstone buildings on Belville Street. You can see my house from here. So this is Charing Cross. Yeah, interesting. And again, these are the Miha photographs, and that main route into town, or the only route in and out of town, has always been an issue, still is when it comes to flooding, crashes, etc. Everyone then takes a run through the East End, and we know how that ends up. So, to recap, we've seen how the views have changed, how the town has changed, or the East End or Belville Street area has changed through industrialisation, and then how it suffered through industrialisation, through housing, and through the Blitz, and just that mass of people looking for housing and places to work. So we're now moving to the 60s and see how things have changed more into our lifetime. So we're now looking at the things that had to, or things that changed. So this is the bottom of St Lawrence Street, Plantation Cottage, the old houses of the East End. We're looking up towards the building of the new flats. So this is the Now Road, I think, yeah. And again, you can see my house from here. And this is another great view of the changing face of Belville Street. So we've gone, as I say, from the rows of tenement flats to more modern concrete, fast built high flats and stilted houses. Down towards St Lawrence's Church with the underpass and the stilted houses on your left, and one of the courts. Down to Orchard Street, Kirchbarn Augustine, St John's Episcopal Mission, and Scots in the background. Again, this was happening all over town, so a view through to Kirchbarn Church, the new, on that Teviot Court or Teviot Place, the new houses, then over to high flats, the Bow Road high flats. This was the changing horizons of Greenock. We were going up the way. So again, the building of the high flats in winter time is just the start of building. Just some detail again of the stilted housing and the methods of production. So concrete was the property of the future, and we can see that in the town centre. We can't criticise too much, because we were, after the war, people wanted a change, people needed a change, and the idea that the new modern building material would be faster, cheaper, build different kinds of buildings was seen as attractive. Maybe not so much now, but I don't think you can blame people for going along with it, considering what they'd been through. So again, we're looking west from St Lawrence Street. You can see two temporary buildings here, actually. Just realised that, two tin buildings post-war, and this is it as it's changing. So from the last two buildings, you can see, the last two slides, you can see this scene changing quite dramatically. The road down Orchard Street. Is it Orchard Street? The road down quite substantially, well, it turned into a path eventually. Kirkborn Church was left derelict for a long time, suffered fires. And now we're getting more into the future where, with all the issues of construction of the high flats, I told you they were built quickly and cheaply, they decided to put hats on them in order to try and help with the various issues. So at some expense these were put on, only to be taken down shortly thereafter. Again, this is a view looking up from the bottom of St Lawrence Street, as was looking along Serpentine Walk, the old houses, the view towards St Lawrence's Church. And this was the replacement houses being taken down. So again, the same view some 40 years later. So a town changes rapidly over years, over a lifetime. Things don't last, but this is people's lives. You know, people grew up in these buildings, had their children here, went to school from here. They were sources of stories, lives. So this is part of the social history of Belville Street. Just how lives change while buildings change, but there are stories within these buildings that are important. So accompanying these changes in the high flats, or with high flats, was a change in the economy and the way things were going. So we had these housing, but the start of the end of shipbuilding. So we can see the high flats, but we also see the decline in the Scots buildings starting to be taken down in the late 1980s. Deindustrialisation is the term they give to this, and we are now in a period of post-industrialisation, or even post-deindustrialisation, because we're now in the point where we're in a quandary as to what we do. Are we a service town? The majority of people who work in Greenock now work for the council, whereas before it would have been heavy industry. What are the opportunities for people now? And this is what we're going to look at now, just how the townscape has changed and how Belville Street has changed as a result of this. So if we go back to our original photographs and the coming of the railway, this is the same photograph. So looking from Belville Street, St Lawrence Street, we now see the view. The railway has remained, industry has been and is gone. Same view, again, the railway, the omnipresent railway from 1840, but the changing view. Scots is gone, Kincaid's is gone, and now we're building warehouses, call centres, health, service provisions. This is what Greenock is changing into. And this is how we see it now. This is post-industrial Greenock. This area went from, in the 1800s, being warehouses, building some of the nation's first railway engines, to the engines built by Kincaids and Scots, right through to now where it's call centres. Scots, as was. Over 200 years of shipbuilding on this site. Removed, gone, but still there is that eeriness as you walk along. If you know the history of Greenock and you walk along past the dry dock and along behind RBS and everything everywhere, you can get a sense of what it used to be like. You can imagine the people working there. And as I say, my father worked basically in this area for 40 years. So when I walk along there, I sense his spirit, if you like. So the site is cleared. The Belville Street flats dominate the skyline. And this is a view looking east along Ingleson Street. So we've got Baker Street in the front, the Sea Cadets here. This all used to be refineries, Scots Engine Works, and now we have the realigned road, Ingleson Street onto Belville Street past the high flats. And now the completed view post Scots. Everything everywhere, the Royal Bank Mortgage Centre, Cigna. This is a view of Arthur Street. These were taken by a good friend, and it showed the demise of shipbuilding and engineering. Mr. Kelly, James Kelly. Again, looking up Arthur Street through the tunnel and the engine works on left and right. So again, it's a contrast, isn't it? It's that end of an era of engineering to looking up towards modern housing, which in itself wouldn't last another 40 years. So it's a period of change, all change, and nothing signified it more than the end of the Belville Street flats. A dramatic night. I watched this. I was evacuated from. We were evacuated from our house, and we went to look at it on Regent Street as it came down. And you know, it's amazing how it's like a scene from Still Game, but you know, people were out in their hundreds, if not thousands, to watch this. Okay, again, I'd like to thank Doogie Cool for these images. And again, some symbolic, if you like, images of post-modern housing. Belville Street has gone full circle. We've gone from the country homes of the provosts and the sugar merchants and the engineers and the shipmasters through an industrialisation where housing for the working classes were built in the East End. On the parkland of Belville Street, up came tenement flats housing 10, 11, 12, 13 single ends, multiple occupancy flats, to a new era where new construction materials allowed people to build up the way and concentrate population, only to find that this wasn't what people wanted. They didn't want necessarily to live in high flats. The building of them also suffered in that they were leaky, not built in the best way, and so they had to come down. I'll leave you with this final view, and it's just to show you that hopefully you've understood or realised how you can look at a small community closely and see life, or you can see then the story of a town encapsulated in that small area. Belville Street has looked over, if you think about it, commerce and industry. It's looked at ships from the West Indies, East Indies, America coming in with cargoes of tobacco, sugar, rum, and then seen harbours being built to accommodate them, and then industry established in order to build the ships in order to continue that. So it's looked over the harbours and industry of Greenock for 200 years, and is now at a point where, what is it looking forward to? What is the future of this area? You know, it has been returned to a park, you know, so Belville Gardens have returned to this area to the way it was 240 years ago. Well, I've wittered on quite long enough, I think, so an hour and a bit of your time is thank you for your patience, thank you for listening. Any comments, please get in touch, and any inaccuracies or wrong facts are entirely my fault, and I shall rectify them at a future date. Thank you.